Some of us are here in the auditorium and some of us are at home watching the live stream. We welcome members of our sister programs who are joining us remotely, the University of Georgia and UMass Boston. We thank our underwriters who support the entire 2023 series, the Byrne Foundation, Caldwell Law, Concord Coach, Kendall at Hanover, Ledyard Bank, and the Village, as well as the sponsor for this session, Mariner Wealth Advisors. Just in case there is anyone attending for the first time, I will remind you of the Q&A procedures. Those in the auditorium were given an index card when they entered. Please write your questions on this card and drop them in the basket on stage, which is right there. For those on live stream, please enter your questions in the chat window. Someone will transcribe the questions and give them to the moderator. We'd also like to invite you to a post-lecture discussion session, which will be held immediately after the lecture in OSHER's Classroom 3A. I'm supposed to say that the break will be held in the lobby due to the weather, but no refreshments may be brought into the auditorium. Now it is my pleasure to welcome Bill Sullivan, who will introduce our speaker.
Good morning, everybody. And it's my pleasure to be able to introduce today's speaker, Rear Admiral Michael Studeman, who's had a very distinguished Navy career, to say the least. He has just completed an assignment as commander of the Office of Naval Intelligence and director of the National Maritime Integration and Principal Intelligence Officer Advisor to the Director of National Intelligence. Previous assignments, which have given him the expertise in China, the most important one of those would be when he was Director of Intelligence for the Indo-Pacific Command, as it is called today, which covers everything from the shores of California to the shores of India and basically half of the world. He was also the Director of Intelligence for the United States Southern Command, which covers everything south of the Caribbean. He's a distinguished graduate of the National War College, which is the senior war college of all of them for all of the military forces in the United States. He is a distinguished graduate of the Navy Postgraduate School, where he wrote his thesis on China and Southeast Asia. He's an honor graduate in Mandarin Chinese from the Defense Language School. And his assignments in his career-long focus demonstrate that he really possesses expert knowledge on China and Chinese-U.S. relations, where we are today, what are the flashpoints, and what can we expect from here. So let me introduce to you Admiral Michael Studeman. Thank you.
Hey, that was a very warm welcome. I'm really happy to be here. This is a place where the hospitality is very generous. We had dinner last night with some of the members of the audience, and I'm really impressed by the Granite State here. Got to walk around in Pine Park yesterday, and it was very cleansing for the soul. So I'm going to have to return if the invitation stands open by this crowd. Thank you to the OSHER Lifelong Learning Institute and Dartmouth for putting on this series. I think there's some very important questions that are being raised through this summer series, and I think it's very expert the way this was done with David Shambaugh last week, setting the stage, and then some really hard-hitting questions being asked. So hopefully we can do justice to this one, dealing with potential conflict with the Chinese. Before we get there, I do want to acknowledge the support that Lisa King has offered in preps for this and so many others here, but also to Bill Sullivan. You take a look at, a man, from the mountain. He's one of those in the security community. He spent, over 62 years working as a patriot for the country here. And I think this crowd maybe give him a little bit of an applause here for all of his service over time. Bill and my father, who also was a Navy officer, were neighbors for quite some time, and I always wonder what kind of conversations they had in the backyard there while they were drinking their wine or sailing. I'm very sorry to hear the Chinese backed out of this event. I think that would have been terrific to have them up here, and not only this event, but next week's as well. There's some strange dynamics happening in China these days, and sometimes it's very opaque, but in general, it would have been a high honor to share the stage with General Zhang, to exchange perspectives, to be able to have some candid conversations, some open thoughts. These days, actually, there are too few channels that are open between the United States and the Chinese. If you're in the embassy in Beijing, often the way that the Chinese will talk to the American side is only through démarches, maybe an in-person démarche, and it's really gotten to be very hard to watch, in fact, and does not bode well for U.S.-Chinese relationships if we can't have conversations. And it's a sign of danger ahead if major powers decide to strangle the crosstalk. Right, so hopefully there will be a sea change in this. So I want to express my appreciation to General Zhang in absentia here. I know if it was his choice that he would probably be here. He's been a thoughtful voice on major power dynamics over time. He's somebody you can talk to there. And I think before we begin and talk about major powers and some of the tensions that exist, I think we ought to bring in a human factor just for a second here. Because when you think about a guy like General Zhang or the ambassador for next week, I think we have to respect the kind of pressures that those individuals and their families face in the societies that they live in. Now, they may have gotten used to them over time. They may perform well in those societies. But we know that things are shifting in China. Prior to Xi Jinping, there was actually a fair amount of open dialogue and freedom in the academic environment, and intellectuals were able to debate issues in ways that weren't unlike that in other areas of the world. But in the Xi area, particularly in the last few years, there's been a ideological disciplining, and there's an expectation of conformance there that is truly astounding, and it reminds you of the Mao era there. So it used to be let 100 flowers bloom, let 100 schools of thought contend. Really today, it's not an oversimplification to say it's let one flower bloom and one school of thought flourish, and that's the Xi Jinping thought. And it sounds like I'm exaggerating or using hyperbole, but I'm really not. And so I just want you to imagine for a second how much harder it is for General Zhang and the ambassador and others to live in a state that is becoming more authoritarian. David Shambaugh, I think last week, talked about moving into totalitarianism. If Orwell were looking at China today, he wouldn't believe that a state was able to convert his fiction into something what you see today. And so the real human cost to this, if you're always on your guard, if you're watching your back, if you're a government official and you're being evaluated whether or not you delivered your official talking points the right way, if you were pronouncing the party line, if you're defending the PRC honor, if you're a wolf warrior enough, those are the kinds of pressures that you will never have to face, but folks in that society do. And so I encourage you to differentiate what it means to be a leader, somebody in control in the government Politburo, and the very human issues that are faced by the vast majority of the Chinese who simply want a better life, want a higher standard of living and peace. Okay? So with that to start, let's shift into the topic at hand. The first thing I'd like to say is, okay, what did you mean by conflict? Because there are lots of forms of conflict. So is conflict inevitable? Yes, conflict is inevitable, depending on what spectrum you're looking at here. So everything that you see, if you look at Merriam-Webster's definition of conflict, you already have these checks in the box or red dots in the box that show, in fact, that there are opposing views about how the world should run, what values should dominate, what rule sets should exist, who gets to set them, et cetera, what it means for what form of government works best for societies, et cetera. Now, the question I think that's really being asked, of course, is whether or not there's going to be, a dust-up, a fight, a war of any length, and how could we potentially get there. And so let's dive into that issue. Next slide. So if the Chinese were here, they would probably repeat what they've actually communicated in lots of different fora. And who knows what you get with the Chinese. They may be very, very polite. They may not actually express everything on their minds. But this is the way that the Chinese think about America. They believe that we are a destabilizing and dangerous force in the world. They take a look at how we tried to remake the Middle East and what we did in Iraq and Afghanistan and other places, and they say that we are dangerous because we go in, we break dishes, we leave chaos and suffering in our wake, and then we back out again. And that we've done this repeatedly over time, and we've destabilized in ways that are still causing suffering in other parts of the world. That we are the global hegemon, that will do anything to maintain that amount of control, but we're a declining force. And by declining, they take a look and say, the U.S. is divided into red states and blue states, red players, blue players, that our democracy is both ineffective and inefficient. It's not just messy, it just can't get things done. It's not fit for the modern age. That's another reason why it's declining. We aren't the city, the shining city on the hill anymore. We aren't an example for how to run things here. We had our capital stormed by our own people, that we are riven by different views that are manifesting in violence. They point out that the nature of how our democracy is playing out is no model for any other country. And therefore, we are on the decline. That was also amplified by a sense of isolationist strains that were showing up in intellectual and practitioner channels there, that we should back away from a globalized environment, that we need to protect and only serve Americans in a way that's different than what we set up in Bretton Woods after World War II, to have an interstate commerce system where the rules worked for everybody, and the U.S. would be a major player in sustaining what we set up in the wake of World War II. The Chinese also are not shy about talking about our Black Hand and all the color revolutions. You think about those in your Asia, pick a color, if it's orange or rose or tulip, those kinds of revolutions. The Arab Spring was our fault there. So the Chinese don't see that, in fact, these were popular resentments that built to a point where people decided that they need to press against tyranny. We are the ones who engineered all of those things, and when the leaders were toppled with the enablement provided by the United States, that once again we left countries in chaos with lots of bloodshed and suffering that continues to this day. We are, in their view, and they believe this, that we are trying to encircle and suppress and stop China's rise, because that's what a global hegemon does. If there's a rising hegemon, you must take care of it. That when we operate anywhere near China, we're doing it because we're trying to intimidate and provoke and harass. They believe that when you look at a declining power, that they actually become more desperate as they decline, and therefore are more prone to risk-taking. And so many of the actions that they see, they think are last gasps of a dying sort of empire, and must be anticipated and managed well. They believe with some of our alliances, what we do with other countries, that that's all Cold War mindset thinking. The intent on the Chinese side is a little form of psychological warfare to say, we don't like the Cold War. If we start saying these are Cold War mindset, we want people to avoid organizing for success the way that we did in the Cold War. And so this becomes sort of a trope that the Chinese use to say that alliances are artifacts of another era and they are not suitable for the 21st century. The Chinese, in their hearts, believe that we are trying to change the status quo over Taiwan. This is what we'll get into a little bit more. In their view, we started in motion a number of different trends which are heading in exactly the opposite direction. And so where there was stability for the longest time, our independent unilateral actions began a series of events that make Taiwan more inclined to be separated permanently from the motherland. China, on the other hand, is a force for peace. There's peace in their DNA, according to them. Don't mind the Warring States period or centuries of bloodshed in China. You will get if you go to a Confucius Institute, you'll get a very whitewashed sense of Chinese history with the Belt and Road initiatives. You are looking at a country that, in fact, does provide a lot of capital for connectedness and prosperity. We can talk about where that has taken the Chinese and other countries that have taken that capital and the debts. But essentially, these are the things that the Chinese probably would have said here when they compared the United States and the Chinese. So, at the end of the day, this issue that we talk about with potential war is one over core sovereignty issues and who's to blame and how we got here. Chinese will warn. They are good strategic signalers. And they have already used very stark terms when they say that the United States is playing with fire. That's typically a notice that we're near a red line that the Chinese have set out. Okay, we're going to convert a little to political science for a second, and we're going to talk about, well, what in general creates the situation where you might, in fact, find war on the horizon. And so these are the things that students will study for an entire year in their security courses. If you are looking all the way back to Thucydides, I think we may have talked about some of that last week, or if you want to look up Graham Allison talking about the Peloponnesian War, fear, honor, and interest, or the classic explanations for why nations go to war. If you're looking at maybe explaining Putin's decision on Ukraine twice, you might look at grievances, ambition, and insecurity, and the rest is sort of fairly obvious, I guess, to you. And many of these things are actually in play today when you take a look at the China-United States dynamics here. Poor communications, there are misperceptions we can go into more. There is a sense that power is growing, power imbalances. They hear that the Chinese are gaining significant power, not just the correlation of forces, but if you indexed comprehensive national power of nations, that China is coming on strong. There's a sense, there's chatter about how China might be able to solve its problems with a short war. Countless nations have also held the sort of optimism bias that's led them to pay a butcher's bill ultimately when the wars were extended and lasted a lot longer and were far more costly than anticipated. This is in play now with some of the considerations, and of course Thucydides' trap, which we can get into here a little bit more. So next slide shows you the rising and declining power theory of a potential clash, where Graham Allison is described in his book and his TED Talk. You can take a look at that if you haven't already, about looking over 500 years of history and finding that 12 of 16 major power declines and rises resulted in a clash of major proportions. And his warning, too, that neither of those nations actually wanted a war, but they were dragged into it by what he calls a third-party provocation. Some other party and their desires and their actions led to a series of unfortunate events that created that clash. And so that's the danger here when you take a look at the Thucydides trap. So if you're looking at this as a reserve currency, just one of many metrics there to be able to gauge. You see the Dutch, you see over time the UK, and now here in the 21st century, perhaps another version of major power trends. The next slide shows you some predictions. This is one of the predictions that was made last year by one of many prognosticators who essentially take a look and go, when will the Chinese economy surpass the United States one? What does that mean? So if you're looking at this particular prediction, it would show you that in the late 20s, perhaps the Chinese would have overtaken the U.S. economy. What does that mean? What are the implications? How does that adjust? Now, of course, you have to take this with a grain of salt. I could throw 10 more slides up here and show you different predictions that range from that wouldn't happen to 2035, wouldn't happen until 2050 where the Chinese would take over. It wouldn't happen until 2060 or ever or never, right? And so this debate continues, particularly when you take a look at a number of different factors. COVID impacts on the Chinese economy, struggling to recover. You look at some of the choices that are being made by the central government to begin to emphasize common prosperity, to interfere in the tech sector, to drive away with many of their choices foreign direct investment, the uncertainty of Chinese rules and laws that are having companies rethink what they want to do. And the Chinese passed an anti-espionage law, which makes it very uncertain if there's a company in China that wants to do simple market research. Given the ambiguities of the Chinese law, they could actually be dragged down and arrested for doing that market research because it could be interpreted as trying to gain state secrets. So these are the uncertainties that are changing the nature of investments that are going into China. You add to that some other issues in terms of debt to GDP ratios. China's very high, 275% debt to GDP ratio, which will have consequences. Their demographics are declining, not looking good, heavily in debt, declining productivity, unemployment for the youth is on the rise. There's some significant drags on the Chinese economy that essentially will make some of these rosier predictions probably moot in a short period of time. This is one to watch, but I would say that overall the Chinese economy has been operating in such a way as to defy all expectations, and it's been amazing how the Chinese have got to where they are today. So don't count them out with regard to how they will Rubik's Cube to get solid faces and find a way through some of these things. I have been in the China world for some amount of time, and people have been predicting implosions for the last 25 years. So how will the Chinese muddle on? Who knows? But we know one thing. The Chinese are willing to do extraordinary things to keep that economy going, and they're willing to pollute the Chinese mainland and do other things with the banks and the state-owned enterprises that would defy any logic within a normal country, and they've managed to make that work. So nobody knows where this goes, and we know that China is the graveyard of profits, and so stay tuned to where this is. But it's very disturbing when economic power is converted to other ambitions that are security focused. And what does that mean when they're extending their power out to the rest of the world, and what do they actually want to see by way of a changed world? These are the ways that we need to monitor how they take any growth and convert it into other forms of power. Next. Okay, so there's some general sources of U.S.-China friction. I name a few of them here. This looks like we're being unkind to the Chinese, that we are maligning and smearing the Chinese. This slide would be very offensive to them. But I would say that if you wanted to go into every one of these blocks, we have more than ample proof with regard to where the Chinese are going with their approach. And their approach to their rejuvenation, to realizing their dream, is almost a Machiavellian one in terms of the ends justifies the means. Do whatever it takes, right? And so you find that they're not often following the rules that we expect every other country to play by, right? And if you can get away with it, why would you change your ways, right? So for the Chinese, if you're talking about corruption, that is a standard form of the way that they would exert influence. They would buy off political and business elites in a country where they want to do business, right? That sets the stage to have a secret deal where it's very opaque, and they can get an advantage, they can no competitive bids, et cetera, and all of a sudden they're off and running, right? So corruption is a standard form. Surveillance systems unto themselves, it's just technology, right? But the way that it's being employed to create a very oppressive society in China and then deliver to other societies where authoritarian leaders use that technology for ill and not in service of citizens is a trend that we're seeing throughout. Failure to honor agreements, we can talk about the WTO or UNCLOS or any of the other areas where the Chinese are not. They're signing documents, but they aren't actually fulfilling their obligations. So if we talk about undermining world order, you remember the UN Tribunal on the law that judged the Philippine claim that the Chinese historic rights, were not legitimate, and the UN said, you're exactly right, they're not legitimate. China has blown those off, and so many other rules there in their periphery and the littorals with extraterritorial claims. They're the sources of major parts of friction that we see today. And then one of the reasons why we are forced to do things like freedom of navigation operations, which essentially express non-acquiescence to extraterritorial claims, right? Which you have to do over time, otherwise, a state may be, given certain rights that they don't deserve. So other things you see on here, power projection. Countries that are big, that have interest globally, will project power. They'll have, flag follows trade. They'll have their version of coaling stations that we generated around the world when we were growing as a young country, and the Chinese are doing the same, right? But what you do with that power when you're extending it and how this plays into grand geopolitics remains to be seen, one to watch. On the lending side, the Chinese have offered their capital. There's been debates about debt trap diplomacy and what that really means. But just take a look at a dozen odd countries that are actually at risk of default today. Right, and so there is a consequence for some of the choices that the Chinese have made with regard to how they lend. So if you're talking about Pakistan or Sri Lanka, Kenya, Ethiopia, Laos, Zambia, Mongolia, Ghana, there's tremendous political and economic instability in those countries where they're facing near defaults or they've had to make very, very tough choices there. So whether you call it influence, coercion, or predatory practices, so those things are having some serious consequences out there. And the fact that when the Chinese do this is not transparent, it makes it so much more difficult. So today, for example, in a normal situation where a country might be in severe debt, you turn to the International Monetary Fund or the World Bank. They can't even then take over some of these issues with countries because they can't get the details of the deals that the Chinese struck with those host countries. So very, very complicated situation, a source of friction with regard to how countries should be operating. The IP theft, intellectual property theft, has been rated at $250 to $600 billion a year that the Chinese steal. So we talk a lot about our technological edge, and we're going to speed our technology and innovation car so that it goes faster. That's the way we're going to compete. But the Chinese are in the back seat. It doesn't matter how fast you go in that car. And the Chinese have penetrated our society. They have people. They have cyber penetrations across the board, and they've been stealing that amount of technology, which changes the balance of power. If you take a look at how many ways the Chinese have been able to build up their power, particularly military power, it's largely on your backs, your intellectual property that has been taken. Some of it is overt. This is the Chinese in academic institutions or laboratories. Some of it is because they do legitimate deals with U.S. companies that share their trade secrets as the price of doing business in China. But a significant amount of this is straight on, large scale, continual, unabated intellectual property theft through the thousands of cyber professionals that they have that take advantage of our vulnerabilities and many other countries' vulnerabilities. And you can't afford, when it's trillions and trillions of dollars of your IP over years, to stay competitive if you don't fix that problem, a source of friction with China. The information environment where you have the propaganda, the buying up of media all over the world, the kind of statements that the Chinese make and push through. So the United Front political, United Front actions, actions are seriously, in fact, influencing a number of different countries. You can read about it in Australia's history, of how influential those are, being able to actually support a number of things that co-opt politicians, that are, in fact, activating students to protest when they hear things. Anyway, a very, very active arm of communist countries, right, in general. But here it's been externalized and then pushed out to the rest of the world. The alternative entities, 17+1 in Eastern Europe, you can talk about Shanghai Cooperation Organization, ASEAN +3, the list goes on there. And then insinuating themselves in existing international institutions with significant successes, trying to change standards there that would benefit the Chinese in the long run, that would not be in the best interest of the United States and other countries. And so that's continuing with an intent to change from the inside. And so they've been very successful, in fact. Today, you go into the United Nations documents and you take a look at what universal values consist of. The Chinese were able to add that development is a universal right there. And the intent in doing that is not because that's wrong, but it's designed to dilute, in fact, the freedoms and liberties of individuals are also universal rights. And so the Chinese will slowly kind of work their philosophies into the international system that way. Okay, that's a lot on that one slide. I apologize. Let's go to the next one. Let's talk about potential sparks, right? So we have the backdrop of conflict. We've talked about sources of general friction that make the environment testy. And then when you have a lot of dry grass, right, then the question becomes, where is that spark? And the sparks can come from any of these areas that you see here. An attack on the homeland. You know that America's Day actually starts in the Indo-Pacific. The sun rises on America in Guam, a U.S. territory. If that were attacked, that's an attack on the homeland, right? And so we've seen a number of disturbing developments already in peacetime with regard to Guam. An aggression against Taiwan, where that leads, a third party, as we talked about before. Use of force against an ally. 5 of our 7 defense treaties are in the Indo-Pacific. So you talk about South Korea, Japan, the Philippines, Australia, to a lesser extent Thailand. So use of force in certain ways there would spark a activation of mutual defense alliance there. This one over here is strange. You might take a look at enforcement of domestic laws and international common and say, what the heck is that? And if you took a look at an example, I guess the most common one, I guess, that's been cited recently is taking a look at China's Coast Guard law, which was passed about 2 years ago, 2021. And it empowers the Chinese Coast Guard to essentially react to a foreign warship or government vessel that's operating in any of their claimed areas and use force to be able to eject it from their claimed areas. And when you have wide claimed areas, that we call the 9-dash line, sometimes 10, 11-dash line, that whole wide swath is what they claim. You're saying that in that entire area where they have a high amount of international commerce, the Chinese Coast Guard is authorized to use force to be able to push foreign warships out or government vessels? And according to the Chinese, the answer is yes. They haven't done it. Here, I think they're very wary, but it's very telling with regard to how the Chinese work. The Chinese typically will try to get a legal justification and use law to be able to get some sort of rationale before they do something. These are very disturbing trends when you think about safety and security of the international commons and what it could mean for not just our Navy, but other navies, other rival claimants that exist in that part of the world. Loss of life in sea, in the air, heavy-handed bullying, collapsing economies, and the strangenesses that happen when countries may want to look outside of their own country to do a wag the dog kind of situation to distract the public from a bad situation, rally nationalism. Those are the kinds of things you can get yourself into a theory of a road to war going down that particular line. Let's talk about loss of life at sea and in the air just for a second as we think about sparks. We go to the next slide, yeah. We take a look at what we're seeing today. Deep level concern about the level of risk-taking the Chinese are taking. Our sense is, though we don't know for sure, that the whole Russia-China collaboration issue, or the Russians who have done things like this for years in the Black Sea and other places, have essentially said, hey, China, you need to stand up for yourself, do more. The Americans aren't going to do anything. Raise the cost of doing business to them by doing closer operations. So however they came to their conclusion, what we've seen is in the last couple of years, over 100 intercepts, not every one, but over 100 intercepts that have been very, very close, where they come in literally, within, a few feet, less than 50, less than 20, less than 10 on occasion. So you're flying, at hundreds of miles per hour out there. Our aircraft is in international airspace. It's always been there. It's been doing it for decades, collecting and monitoring so that we're not surprised, that we can collect our own information about what's happening around a very volatile set of flashpoints in the Indo-Pacific near our allies and partners. That's what we do. And the Chinese come up very close. So what I've described is any one twitch of that pilot, and you're going to have a mishap. You're going to have a collision of sorts. It's going to be like the 2001 EP3 incident where a Chinese pilot did the same sort of thing and ended up running into our EP3, causing that incident where the aircraft had to land on Hainan Island, causing an international fur that took months to resolve, right? We're just a twitch away from that now, given what you see. The Chinese are even more aggressive when it comes to allies that are operating in the same way that we do, right, when they operate patrol aircraft. So you see that reenactment in the bottom right is an advanced Chinese fighter that decided to dispense chaff. These are the little metal strips that are used to, reflect radar detections if a missile's kind of trying to take out a fighter. They dispensed that chaff right into the intakes of an Australian P-8. And look where they did it. It's not nowhere near China. Like that red dot is way down there in the South China Sea. Can you believe it, right? And so you're seeing this thing, if you're a Canadian aircraft operating in East China Sea as part of the enforcement of sanctions against North Korea, where you have to patrol around to see if there are any violators, ships that may be doing oil transfers or whatever, the Chinese have signed off on those sanctions. They agreed those sanctions should exist against North Korea, and then when we try to enforce it with patrolling to find out what's going on, the Chinese will actually do crazy things around Canadian aircraft. Very dangerous flight activity, very aggressive. So this is very disturbing. Is this going to be a spark? Are we going to have, dead aviators on both sides? Right? We're close here because the Chinese have decided to operate this way. Next slide. So it's not just in the air. This is what you're seeing at sea. And we can just walk around the clock here. You may have seen in the headlines the Chung Hoon was a U.S. destroyer that was going through the international waterway. It was beginning to go north and with another Canadian ship, and this PRC destroyer cuts right across. It violates every regulation that exists out there in the international community, called coal regs. There's a law about the provisions of collisions at sea, violates UNCLOS, UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, violates the Code for Unplanned Encounters at Sea, which the Chinese signed in 2014, and we're finding more of that. That's historically, you've seen it here in the bottom left as well, in parts of the South China Sea, and there's no justification for it. If you're taking a look at the Chinese rationale, they'd say, well, we're going to pressure the Americans. You shouldn't be here in the first place. You're impacting our sovereignty. you're provoking us, we're going to go ahead and do this, we're going to test your responses, we might learn something, and it gives us realistic training. And so there's a sense that if they mix it up with us this way, that maybe they get some realism out of their training. It's a sea change in how the Chinese are approaching their interactions with us. And you take a look at what they've been doing for quite some time to the other Southeast Asian claimant nations there with the water cannoning that they do. Like they hose the bridges, and you've seen the laser dazzling with the Philippines trying to simply resupply one of their outposts, which is actually a rusty old amphibious ship that's barely hanging on into a shoal. They're just trying to resupply that and keep it going while the Chinese are building these huge, massive, reclaimed military bases bristling with capability, and the Chinese are trying to stop them. They hear radio intimidation clustering around them. They do that with oil rigs and oil exploration ships that they didn't sponsor, that Vietnam may host or any other nation. This is just any given day for many of these Southeast Asian countries. Did you know, right? Where does this go? Will this lead to a major loss of life? Will it be a U.S. ally? Will we be dragged into something here? We're very concerned about where these choices are leading going forward. Okay, next slide. Let's shift to Taiwan. And let's just talk about an area of the world which, in fact, might be the one that could seriously bring U.S., China, others to blows. So why is this an issue? Well, because Xi Jinping made it an issue. If you look back in 1972 when Nixon talked to Mao Zedong and the issue of Taiwan came up, Mao Zedong said, that can wait. It can be 100 years. We'll eventually come back to it, but it could be, we don't want to make that issue something that changes the nature of the geopolitics now. Xi Jinping has a different course. The course that he set out is to say, we need to solve Taiwan, otherwise we have no rejuvenation by 2049. So he's put a timetable to it, right, in terms of it must be solved. You have no dream realized if this is still a problem and Taiwan is not assimilated politically differently than today into China. And he's been preparing his military for options there to be able to do so. So Xi Jinping is very hard over on every sovereignty issue. We've seen that. That's in his blood. And the PLA has been ramping up for many years now, and it's, if anything, only accelerated in terms of the investments in every warfare area, the training, the practicing for what we see there. Very destabilizing overall. The Chinese are also worried about the Taiwan sense of their own identity. If you poll in Taiwan, many of the population there would say, you know what, I don't feel like I'm a mainland Chinese person displaced in Taiwan, or that I want to go back to the mainland. I feel like I am, in my heart of hearts, Taiwanese, and I enjoy the democracy and the freedoms that I have today. And if you're Taiwan, there's been a deep concern about what China's ambitions may be, because they can't trust when China brings this formula called the one country, two systems. That was their formula. One country, China, two different systems. For a time, right, people were thinking perhaps this is the way that you might find some middle ground here. And Hong Kong was sort of the test case, right? They turned over Hong Kong, the Brits did in 1997. Hong Kong was supposed to have 50 years of autonomy, and that suddenly ended, didn't it, right? So the Chinese got impatient. They wanted to have more control over Hong Kong a lot earlier. The Chinese approach to Hong Kong was to decide how their chief executive was going to be chosen, and then did other things that eventually created some instability there, because people rightly took a look and said, they're changing, they're beginning to extinguish the freedoms that we've known, and they rose up in the umbrella revolution and in other ways that you saw. And the Chinese then said, hey, there's just instability, they will crush it. And they cracked down, and that democracy essentially has been extinguished for all intents and purposes. It's there in name only. If you're Taiwan and you take a look and go, oh, I'm being offered this one country, two systems formula too, it means nothing, right? If you see Hong Kong and where the Chinese decided to go with Hong Kong. So if you're in Taiwan, you'd say, if I actually politically unite with this regime, I know what's coming, right? And it will be not my own system, it'll be an assimilation essentially into the Borg. So the Chinese are sensing this too, and so they think that perhaps time may not be on their side. The other issue at hand is, this driving some of these issues is whether or not Xi Jinping believes that because he's over-leveraged so many countries around the world economically, that he can get them to essentially stand pat, be mute, not participate in sanctions, or essentially do nothing if he goes. And that's part of the calculation. So anyway, for the near term, you've heard a lot about the 2027 date. The Chinese, Xi Jinping set that out to say, get ready by. It's not an iron countdown to 2027, as far as we know. But essentially is, I want the PLA, the People's Liberation Army, to be ready to do anything I ask them to do with regard to Taiwan, no matter how hard it is, no matter if it's taking over Taiwan with an invasion, and no matter if it also involves U.S. intervention, you need to be able to handle it, PLA. And he's doing everything in his power to drive that PLA to be ready for that kind of event, right? And in doing so, creating a huge amount of disruption, a huge amount of anxiety, a huge amount of instability in the Western Pacific, right? So today, you're already seeing the coercion tactics. The Chinese would love to be able to not go to war and to simply have Taipei conform and start talks to politically reunify. That is the gamut that you see with increased activity all around Taiwan. Some of it is punishment to Taiwan. It's punishment on Taiwan to demonstrate a signal to the United States that the trend of Taiwan thinking about, more than just de facto independence, has to be arrested and as a form of warning that's coming through military forces. Because if you're Chinese, your diplomacy, your informational activities, your economic activities didn't change the nature of where things are headed now, right? The Chinese think there's a slippery slope that's moving away from them, and they have to arrest that negative trend. And so that's the reason why they're using what's left to them, which is military force, using more overt military means to then go after Taiwan. Savvy? So the question is, if those don't work, and Xi Jinping is pressuring, is it going to be something more violent later on? And this is the huge question mark, which all the Indo-Pacific is very concerned about. Next. Okay, here's another way to look at it. If you wanted to go into maybe a little bit more of the theory, you'd say, okay, if you looked at capability, intentions, and opportunity, and if that triangle closes, if the vertices touch, then the prospect for war may be much more likely, right? So you take a look and go, let's look at intentions. The intentions are pretty darn clear on the Chinese side. I just described Xi Jinping's thoughts. Capability, you see them rapidly moving to get advanced capabilities in every warfare area, right? So they've been working on that for 20 years, and it will continue apace. So the question is not going to be about intentions and capabilities really in a few years. The question is about the opportunity line, right? And what pushes up from there, right? Does the Chinese government believe that they'll be able to manage the economic fallout, the geopolitical, the reputational damage by going after Taiwan? Are they going to be able to show that they were legitimate in their actions, take the moral high ground? Those are the kinds of things that are going to play into that opportunity analysis, including, is America continuing to be riven, divided, or is there strength in the alliance system? Does a democracy stand strong? Are they united on these security issues? If you go now, you're going to have a strong government, a strong people with a public will that will support, countermeasures. What does that look like? And the Chinese will be analyzing these things when they look at the opportunities that may exist, right? So anyway, another way of looking at it, I have up here a war of choice and a war of necessity. there are conditions under which the Chinese would choose to go to use violent means to resolve a problem if they believe, for example, that Taiwan moved towards independence and crossed that red line, right? And so that's the issue with Taiwan, is that third-party variable. Are they going to maintain status quo, or are they going to move to try to exert independence in any number of ways that they might move in that direction? That would be foolhardy. It's not what U.S. policy supports. That is a variable that we may not be able to fully control. With previous governments in Taiwan, we have been very clear about not moving towards de jure or official independence there. Okay, next slide. Okay, so here's some things overall that may be useful. When we take a look at misperceptions, remember that was the backdrop of potential conflict. These misperceptions are really important, right? And how do you correct those? So some of these misperceptions are very, very sticky. But if you're on the Chinese side, you think, hey, I didn't do anything. The Americans started this, and they just started like warming up to Taiwan and providing them with a whole bunch of arms and encouraging their independence. And on the U.S. side, our view is, wait a second. Nobody in the national security community in Washington decided to say, hey, even though I'm busy with Afghanistan pullout, I've got Iraq issues, I got Yemen and Saudi Arabia, right? And I've got a number of other things on the docket that I want to put Taiwan on the agenda and just start pushing here and changing the status quo. That did not happen in the Pentagon. That did not happen in the White House. So what actually happened was the growth of the Chinese PLA and Xi Jinping's rhetoric and his behavior around his periphery, all of them combined to create the sense that Taiwan, if it stayed on course with its current capabilities, would essentially be rolled over by the Chinese. And so we realized that in the face of manifesting threats that Taiwan, and under our Taiwan Relations Act, we needed to provide sufficient defense articles for their defense, and that's what happened, right? So we're fulfilling our legal obligations that we signed, 40 years ago, that provide Taiwan an ability to defend itself and not have another country be tempted to use the force of arms to resolve that political problem. That's what the Taiwan Relations Act calls for. And so we did our part, right? And other countries have also expressed support for Taiwan, not because they see Taiwan as an independent sovereign nation, but because they realize that democracy, right, deserves to be supported and for the status quo not to change. So that is a huge misperception. The Chinese would say, I didn't have anything to do with it. We take a look and say, you certainly put this in motion, and now simply we are reacting. This view that we've changed our policy, there are a lot of voices in America, actually, they're saying, yeah, we should just have Taiwan be independent, and those are not helpful. So we allow First Amendment, freedom of speech, and all those things, and we respect those views, and certainly emotionally, people will want to see freedoms and democracy continue to flourish. But that's not our policy. Our policy right now is to not have Taiwan shift its status in any way, period, right? And we stand by that particular policy. Other areas of misperceptions, we talked about some of these earlier here, but when we do a Taiwan Strait transit, in our view, we're expressing support for freedom of the seas, being able to go through an international waterway. By the way, it is the most economical way to pass through during, certain movements, military forces. The Chinese think that every time we do that, essentially we're saying two things. One, we're saying, I'm between you, China, and Taiwan, so I'm a line of defense. So you're gonna have to go through me if you want to do anything against Taiwan. The Chinese also think that the sex signal is, Taiwan, I love you, go for independence. I encourage your independence because I'll be here to support it. That's how they interpret those transits. So you have two different perceptions. One, freedom of navigation. The second one, interpreted by China as encouraging Taiwan independence, right? These are dangerous things if they're allowed to fester and continue on these misperceptions. And same thing, we can talk a little bit more maybe about the Q&A with regard to our reconnaissance operations and freedom of navigation. It's a completely different set of things that are happening related to, not Taiwan in particular, but they're related to Chinese extraterritorial claims and what nations do to support the world order, international law as called for, and what you have to do to be able to non-acquiesce to those claims. Okay, next slide. All right, this kind of sums up some of the areas I talked about, and I just wanted to add on a final thought with regard to what it all means. So if you're looking at these crisis points, you're alarmed. Like almost every country is very alarmed with what they see. If you're on the Chinese side, you're taking a look at what we do in the blue box, and you go, oh my God, I got congressional delegations, I got the Speaker of the House that decided to go. That looks like a high political leader within America is treating Taiwan like it's another state, like an independent state. That's how they interpret those visits. Same thing with congressional delegations, right, to a lesser extent. And those have continued on. We've calibrated a little bit with some of them, but the legislative branch does what it chooses. It can't simply just kowtow to the executive branch. So our Congress has decided to, in fact, add themselves into this. And you can say that it's the right thing to do, or you can say, well, it may be the right thing to do, but it also adds friction to the volatile situation around Taiwan. But anyway, the Chinese take a look at it, and we know how they interpret it, right? All the way down to arms sales, other forms of international engagement that have occurred there. The Chinese are concerned about all this chatter that some people have about strategic clarity versus ambiguity. Our policies ambiguity, but clarity keeps coming back in, which in my view makes no sense. We can talk about it if you like in the Q&A. And they look at some leaders in Taiwan who may be candidates for their next election in 2024 that have been very, very vocal firebrands for independence. And so how that goes is anybody's guess too. They also take a look at what Taiwan's doing as they ready themselves for potential people's war. The Chinese are very concerned about their ability to potentially handle that. On our side, we take a look at all these things I've talked about. 1C, 2S is one country, two systems. 8 is air defense identification zone. There are new norms that the Chinese military have established with regard to different patrol areas, closer than ever before, more forces forward. Our concern is that they could do something more aggressive at any moment of time with very little warning, okay? So if you're looking at this entire dynamic, everybody feels like their deterrence is failing. If you're Taiwan, you're like, well, I'm seeing more forces closer to me that can threaten all the time. I'm not deterring China from doing more and threatening, my vital security interests, right? If you're Chinese, you're taking a look at it and go, hey, I'm not sure where this is going, but the trend is bad. It looks like Taiwan may, in fact, have more support than ever, but clearly from the United States, and this could encourage them to do something that would be my worst nightmare, right? On my core sovereignty issue. My deterrence is failing. I need to do more. And if the United States take a look and go, oh my gosh, this is now a top issue in the national security environment, where did that come from? And now I've got Chinese forces that at any time might convert to do an island invasion, small island invasion or something like that. Therefore, I need to be there to make sure that we're ready to monitor those situations and potentially deal with that and reassure our allies and partners. So everybody feels like the deterrence is failing, and that puts you on a spiral that creates even more tension. Where does the spiral go? Nobody knows, right? That's, generally speaking, what's developing over time. Okay, I'm running out of time, so I will have just, a couple more slides here. Sino-American War would be bad, right? Catastrophe. I think Kissinger used the word Holocaust, right? And he's right, and everybody's right. When you take a look at what the price of war would be, you can walk through this here in terms of where this goes. It would not be a quick war, by the way. It would not be something that everybody just heals from. Whether or not nuclear weapons may be used in this is a question mark, right? The world would be transformed by something of this particular nature. It's not, Hong Kong, a small, little city state right here where the Chinese had all of their security forces. There's a different situation with Taiwan entirely, 24 million people in democracy. But you're going to see, if something happens, a major shift. The world will be changed by something of this nature. And ultimately, I think what you'd find is that there'd be so much chaos that the Chinese, who, if they were optimistic about their chances there, would ultimately find the more likely outcomes would be either failure, stalemate, or even a Pyrrhic victory, which would, in fact, create so much damage to China that it would be regime changing, and Xi Jinping would, in fact, be kicked off the stage as the president, chairman, party secretary, because he would be ultimately responsible for making that decision. So anyway, how do we avoid this strategic blunder? This is a central question for policymakers and senior leaders going forward, particularly in the next few years. Okay, final slide here. My thoughts are, when we take a look at the Chinese, they're not afraid to call us out as enemy number one. We are the hegemon. Their intent is to displace us on the planet. They want to be number one and become the strongest pole in a multipolar system. And so how we deal with China with this sort of attitude becomes very, very challenging. We think in terms of, with the poll last week, do you think of China as a competition, as an enemy, is it a partner? The Chinese have answered that question for themselves. They see us as an enemy there, and they don't believe when we say competition that we actually mean competition. They think that many of our competition options actually are just outright hostility. And so what you find is this dynamic here where on the Chinese side in particular, their views are hardening, and that's resulting in some of the choices that you've seen with Xi Jinping. So while there are lots of common areas where we could talk on, pandemic, climate change, nuclear proliferation, peacekeeping operations, a lot of different areas, these issues are really crowding out an ability to talk to the Chinese now, and I think we're going to see more isolating choices there from the Chinese going forward. The problem is, I think, that the Chinese leadership are becoming the chief engineers of their own crises. We saw that in the line of actual control with India, that the Chinese were the ones that initiated patrols and set up encampments there, resulting in a near-war situation with India that was initiated by the Chinese. With regard to South China Sea, COVID, Wolf Warrior, now Taiwan, Chinese choices are putting the Chinese in a position where they're creating their own problems. It's almost as if they paint themselves in the corner and then they act like a cornered animal. And so this does not bode well going forward. And frankly, the Chinese have a very hard time seeing that, in fact, their own behavior is the cause of any of this, right? And you can't question Xi's choices in the system that exists there today. So anyway, growing misperceptions and risk-taking is occurring. If we want to arrest this downward spiral, it will take more wisdom, more thoughtful ways that we're going to approach the network of relationships that exists. And if we don't get it right, I'm afraid that everybody in this audience, online, and in other places will be deeply affected by what happens. So the responsibility is fundamentally shared by all to ensure that we can maintain the peace and manage our differences going forward. Okay, a lot of heavy thoughts for you, but you guys brought up the topic, right? And so once you get into it, what you find is that you're going to have to actually put yourselves in a position where you see the full seriousness of what we're dealing with here. And hopefully your prayers, your support over time on our side to make sure America makes the right choices will be helping us along the way to maintain the peace. Thank you very much.
Well, if you're sitting easily in your seats, you shouldn't be. We're going to take a 30-minute break now. Coffee and cookies are, I guess, available downstairs. We're going to please write your questions down on a paper and put them in the basket right up here on the stage. And there'll also be questions coming in from people watching via Zoom, and then we'll get into the Q&A in 30 minutes. And I'm sure you're going to have a lot of puzzle questions thrown at the Admiral. Thank you very much.
Bill?
Thank you. If I may have your attention now, we can handle some of that's a bright light. Get to deal with the questions. Obviously, the Admiral's talk has generated a lot of questions. There's one very straightforward one I'll answer, and the question was from a couple of people, what does the CCP mean? Chinese Communist Party. Okay. Next question is...
Done and done.
Yeah. From the University of Massachusetts OLE program, how would this presentation be different if the Chinese speaker was present today?
I just answered that question down below. I probably would have been a little more circumspect because if he were here, the dynamics would have changed. If we were up here on the stage after, then that particular general would have had to defend Xi Jinping's choices, his honor, the honor of his country, and that would have been the dominant theme of this section here. And so I would have thought about that and probably would have made it easier for the general to have talked about some of the substance of the issues rather than just reacting out of a sense of obligation to support Xi Jinping and company. The fact that he wasn't gave a little more license, but you know, I understand how emotional some of these issues can be. But at times like this, I think the American people is owed the truth. I believe that we ought to be candid and direct about some of these really tough challenges. If you're potentially going to be in one of these crises, then you should know how we're potentially dealing with it or contending with it now. And maybe you have a role to some extent in this, right? The worst thing is that we as a government hide these issues from you, and then there's the shock and surprise and dismay that could paralyze and immobile U.S. decision-making when push comes to shove. So how do we become more aware? What are our obligations to have conversations with our country? I believe firmly that where we have unclassified information to share, that you deserve to know what's going on.
All right. And now a little tricky one. This is from the Peter in the OLE program at the University of Georgia. How well does our government, the President and the Congress, understand the points you have made in this presentation today? Do you have confidence that I'm going to stop that last one. I don't want to read that. We'll stick with this.
The one question that could get me in very, very deep trouble. I believe that the President of the National Security Council and serious-minded members of Congress understand many of these dynamics. The U.S. government is doing many significant things to deal with some of the challenges that China presents to the United States. Many of them are perhaps behind the scenes or being taken care of without a lot of public hoopla, but rest assured that there are significant things that are underway that are designed to ensure that we can deal not only with the peacetime competition and the intensifying nature of it, the crisis elements there, but all the way through, full-on execution of potential military plans. And so those things that the executive branch is responsible for, they are doing their level best to pursue. On the congressional side, you'll notice that there is a setup of a China Special Committee. Rep. Gallagher has been very vocal with regard to some of the issues that he's trying to assume in there. There are more China discussions in other committees, and I do believe that those debates are being had. And so my personal view is that on the China account, on the China issues, that this is the one theme that could actually unify the country more than any other, right? We are very divided, but on this one, if you understand kind of the basic facts of it, all Americans should be behind protecting themselves and figuring out ways to be able to ensure that we still maintain a competitive edge, that our businesses can flourish, that, our security interests are protected, and those are our allies and partners. And so why isn't this issue being one where it doesn't matter if you're a Democrat or a Republican or an independent, be the one thing that we can rally behind? We need some of those. We need unifying themes, and this one isn't concocted. This isn't made up, like we need some threat after the Soviet Union. This is a more significant threat because the Chinese economy is so much larger and because they're penetrating in so many additional areas that the Soviet Union never had capability to do so. The Chinese dangers are more significant in the 21st century than Russia's dangers are or were in the 20th century. This is what we can have a conversation about, and then how do we actually then mobilize ourselves, marshal our resources to take care of this particular danger, which has the potential to change and reshape the lives of every American and the nature of the world going forward, right? That's my view.
Okay. And there are several questions that relate to Xi Jinping in terms of his vulnerabilities, his actual degree of control. How much does he have to say about what the Army does? Is the Army, or is the PLA truly directly and responsible to him?
Yeah, the People's Liberation Army is the party's army. It is designed to support the Chinese Communist Party and those in power, Xi Jinping and company. So it is different than the United States military or other militaries there in supporting. It would be like the Republican Party that had full power and concentrated force, and it had its own army associated with it, right? And they've had that since the People's Liberation Army was first, established in 1949. And so the degree of control is fulsome and complete. If you take a look at the Central Military Commission, the chairman of the Central Military Commission, the body that governs all military affairs, the chairman is Xi Jinping. He's the party secretary, he's chairman of that body, and he's also the president. And so the question is with the PLA, whether in a certain crisis that Xi Jinping would necessarily get all of the correct information on what's developed. And we've seen in previous cases where some information was left out, some reportage there didn't quite get through. And so the leadership in Beijing had a fairly warped view of what was going on. It could be submarine accidents, it could be what was happening with the EP3 case, it could be any number of other case studies. So the question is, what kind of decisions would a country make in a crisis if they don't actually have 100% of that knowledge? And if you're in the PLA, think about it. Not only your career, but your life and the prosperity of your family is at stake. If somehow you messed up and you're responsible for the mistake, the consequences could be, very, very significant. You saw in the anti-corruption cases where Xi Jinping essentially changed the nature of many of the very senior leaders. That can happen to anybody in China, but particularly anybody in the PLA. And so there's an incentive to actually sugarcoat or provide a sunnier, summary of events there. And that's what we're concerned about. Will, in a crisis, correct, clean information come up to someone who can decide then what to do next with the PLA?
Several people wonder are there any serious possibilities of internal changes in attitudes among the government in China, different from the ones you have described today? And there are some people wondering, can the NATO, not NATO necessarily, but let's say the European Union help us in developing a dialogue better than the one we currently have with the Chinese officials?
I do think there are some avenues there, but keep in mind that the Chinese government takes a look at many things that are happening, and they think that we are conspiring to bring Europe and our NATO allies in contention with the Chinese, and they take a look at things like the Quad, which is a combination of the United States, Japan, Australia, and now India, and think that essentially coalitions are building against them. And so part of the hardening that you see in China relates to the external environment, which they think is becoming more hostile, to them. For a time, the Chinese were making great inroads economically and just pure influence into the European Union and European powers. And things were definitely going in their direction. I think there's been a sea change with regard to how COVID was handled, how Hong Kong was handled, the Chinese tacit support, it seems, for Russia and its war on Ukraine, repeating Russian propaganda, saying it was justified, the wolf warrior diplomacy. All these things have turned off a lot of European countries, including some of the behaviors when they actually execute contracts in Europe. And I think the China brand has been tarnished, and some are less willing to sort of just focus on economic priorities. Now, the security elements are rising in importance, and I think more nations are more circumspect. So I think there is room for continued dialogue and maybe easier there. Germany is a good example where they continue to do, heavy investments into China, where they are feted when the German leaders go to China. So there are lots of different ways I think we can have interlocutors there to be able to understand, what's happening. But I would say if I summed it all up, I would say that China looks at a world which increasingly seems to be, except for the global south, turning in a way that's very disturbing to them. And they're going to have to recompute and rethink maybe some of their approaches there. And I don't think they've seen a clear way ahead yet in how to deal with the changed circumstances, not only on their immediate periphery, but happening globally.
Does that also apply to the Southeast Asian states in terms of any ability they might have to get this dialogue going better?
Well, I think there's dialogue everywhere. I mean, the United States is actually the more extreme case where it's really been constrained. The trade with Southeast Asia, as you all know, is intense. I mean, the Chinese are the largest trading partner for all of those, states, and so they have the ability to talk on a range of different issues. The security ones where there's tension, less so. Those are also very testy conversations. But the Chinese are looking for opportunities. You take a look at the relationship with Singapore has always been very good. The Singaporeans are very good about being neutral and being able to talk to all parties. And so, that works in terms of ensuring that some amount of crosstalk occurs. The Chinese are putting their bets behind the junta in Burma, and so you see a lot of build-up in terms of basing at Ream and other places there. So the Chinese feel like they're having great conversations with the Burmese at this stage, no matter what's going on domestically. Vietnamese conversations are very close in certain ways, and I think they can be more honest with one another with their dealings, but there are also some hard points in the conversations. So the Philippines, I think the Philippines has had, a change of heart with regard to how much Chinese capital and influence to allow in the Philippines, and they're very concerned about Chinese behavior in the South China Sea. So they're standing up more for themselves now, even at the cost of some economic penalties. Malaysia plays a really complicated game. Thailand as well. So anyway, a lot of partners in Southeast Asia have, a relationship that allows them to have, communications, but in some areas it's becoming, a little more difficult with the Chinese, and they'll manage, but that's the nature of the complexities in that region.
You touched a little bit about this on your talk, but there is a lot of more questions in terms of the Chinese-Russian relationship. and what its impact is going to be in any future activities China might think about in terms of the conflicts that you outlined, and also how important is that relationship to China?
Well, that's an easy question, that latter part. The China-Russia relationship is one of the most important because the Russians have the same philosophy the Chinese do, that the West needs to be taken down a peg, need to have reduced influence. The influence of liberal democracies needs to be less pervasive, and there needs to be breathing room for authoritarian governments and their own rights and interests. And so philosophically, Putin and Xi are melded in terms of what they would like to see in terms of a transformed world, and that's displayed itself in the Ukraine war situation. China has to be concerned about its brand and its image. It tries to curate an image of itself as being neutral and tries to step in, for example, to be a negotiator for a Ukraine peace between Ukraine and Russia. But really their biases, their interests lie with staying as close to Russia as they can. And they're huddling together for warmth in many ways. China is buffering the worst of the sanctions so that Russia doesn't have to feel that pain, and that comes in the form of buying oil and other energy supplies, also helping the Russians with certain technologies that they may not be able to get to support the war machine in Russia. Anyway, China and Russia will be longstanding partners for so long as Xi and Putin are in power, and perhaps longer under different leaders. And we have to be very concerned about what these two major states with nuclear weapons then intend to do together in a crisis situation. Over a Taiwan battle, I don't personally see Russia necessarily joining in and providing direct support to China, but I can see Russia potentially trying to act like a spoiler in terms of sending some of its forces in the Pacific in areas that may try to consume more of our resources if we were trying to track those during a particular event, and maybe doing some other things that would make life more difficult for us without resorting to hostilities or conflict. That relationship is one that's very disturbing. If you look back historically at major powers, we always were concerned about a condominium between China and Russia, and that's why 1971, 1972 were so significant. I mean, the Chinese and the Russians, in the 60s and 70s ended up having their own cleavages for their own, reasons. But Kissinger and others were always very concerned about what happens when you have the Chinese and the Russians together as a bloc, potentially then reshaping the world. And now that's what we face in the 21st century.
There's a lot of discussion today about is this a bipolar world, a multipolar world, and what does really the U.S. and China relationship mean? It seems to me they are the two most powerful military and economic powers. But what about this multipolar world? How does China view that, and how do they view China?
Yeah, I would agree with the Chinese that we're in a multipolar world. The question is whose pole is going up and down. How can you force somebody else's pole to go down or yours to go up? That's the real nature of the push and pull of geopolitics. So if you looked out, many people would actually pile up the European Union as a single pole. Then you take a look at the United States, China, Russia, India, Brazil, various poles that exist out there with varying capabilities. So I think that the world is truly multipolar. And the question is, which poles are working together for what purposes here? Is there a way that all the poles can actually rise and fall in a way that's still going to maintain the peace, that allows for international commerce to take place, for people to deal with the challenges that face our planet? Because these poles are going to have to come together to deal with those successfully. If you find that you have these other tensions that are pulling the poles apart, then we're less well equipped to handle pandemics, climate change, the migration that occurs, the instability that's going to be associated with that. We got some big, big challenges that are ahead of us. These poles need to figure out a way to work together.
What about North Korea? What form of control, if any, does China have relative to controlling North Korean actions in any way whatsoever?
Yeah, it's hard to actually gauge the amount of influence that China has. Clearly has more influence probably than any others there, but you know, Kim Jong-un is his own independent actor, and frankly, he's done a number of things that have ultimately angered China. China wished that he hadn't done, including some of these major weapons tests, the launching of the ICBMs, you know, some of the rhetoric that's associated with that, you know, other choices they've made. So the question is, you know, how much real influence did they have? If they truly exercised all of it, what kind of changes could they actually make to, you know, a very strong-minded dictator in Pyongyang? And so I would say be careful of underestimating it and be careful of overestimating it. That's probably the safest thing you can say there. The Chinese approach currently seems to be that if they just let North Korea do whatever they do without, you know, trying to constrain very much, then the turmoil or the energy that would be consumed by the ROK and the United States may be actually worth it. If I can depressurize my flank by letting North Korea essentially take more attention and consume the time and energy of the National Security Council, you know, some of the senior leaders, maybe some of our military forces, then that's a net good thing. And I think that's actually in their calculus today, is to not let, where they could, KJU do anything so drastic that they would actually begin a conflict there. But agitation is okay if it ends up actually taking away from time that we might devote to other issues that China cares about.
There are a lot of questions relative to the Chinese Navy and the U.S. Navy, comparative strengths. We hear that the Chinese Navy has more ships than the U.S. Navy, but how many of those are capital ships? And what is really the worldwide ability of the Chinese Navy to operate worldwide?
Navy issues, we're getting closer to my color of the uniform here, so this is getting good. So the Chinese Navy surpassed the U.S. Navy in terms of sheer numbers of battle force ships in 2016. The battle force generally is your capital ships and some significant enablers. Submarines sort of count in that. And if you look at the Chinese Navy, they're building carriers, and you know they're trying to transition to have more capability there. It'll take them some years, but they're showing some rapid advances. But a lot of their ship capabilities are, you know, frigates and destroyers. That's where their numbers are. So if you take a look at the U.S. Navy, we're still the largest in the world based on tonnage because we just have bigger ships, aircraft carriers, amphibious, large deck ships. And so if you're looking at trajectories of when their tonnage would be greater than ours, so long as we can predict and see right now, you know, even through the 2040s and 2050s, we still would maintain more tonnage, but they would be rapidly closing those lines and begin to converge. And it depends on choices that our country makes about shipbuilding and the Chinese about shipbuilding that nobody can predict, right? Those are future budgets and future choices. So the Chinese Navy, in terms of its global footprint, they've been doing a number of different things to ensure that they can practice and have all the capabilities to be a global force. They do goodwill visits in a lot of different places. They've been on almost every continent and in repeated ways. And so, look, they are a blue water Navy. They have a view where they talk about near seas defense and far seas protection. That's one of their doctrinal elements within their Navy. And far seas protection will involve something that accompanies the Belt and Road Initiative, where they essentially need to have their ships protect their sea lines of communication. And so if you map out all the areas where they're interested in bases and stations, they're correlated to where they would like to be able to extract the natural resources from the world to support the Chinese economy. So that's the BRI there. But they have also, in some of their investments, faced instability in certain areas. Remember, they had to pull out of Libya, they had to pull out of Sudan, and they needed to do so with capability that was offered by, ships. And so they see that as part of being a global power, not just a continental power, but a maritime power, that they will have to have a global footprint. And in many of the fine print on these deals that they make for port infrastructure, they will sign off that they'll allow, the host nation country will allow the PLA Navy to come in to refuel, replenish, and use that port whenever they so choose. So you may not have fully seen it, but that's part of the blueprint for the Chinese to not just go to, Djibouti and the Gulf of Aden and pretend they're doing counter-piracy. That's all practice for long-range operations, but to truly extend themselves out across all the regions where they have security and economic interests.
There are related questions relative to the Chinese Navy and also just the mainland, from the mainland. Ship-killing missiles, hitting Guam, hitting aircraft carriers and so forth, because we are hearing in some cases the aircraft carrier is slowly dying out the way the battleship did.
Yeah, there are challenges that the last 20 plus years of the PLA building up capability using much of our intellectual property, making advances in hypersonic systems, creating a rocket force that can shoot very long-range ballistic missiles with capabilities that are designed to go after ships and also hit land targets. That force is an incredibly capable force. And so when you think about military matchups, it is wrong-headed to think that the Chinese Navy and the U.S. Navy, that's the only dynamic that's at play. Really, we're talking about how do you move forces to a decisive point to deliver the right amount of power for the effects that you need when you need them, right? And so the Chinese approach has been to build up this entire array of capabilities. Some of them are cruise missiles that are on ships and submarines. Some of these are the rocket forces that I was talking about, to try to keep the Americans at bay if they were to intervene in any sort of crisis. And so they call that the area denial, access denial, and they have spent a lot of money there. And so the question on our side is, how do you continue to make our forces viable and capable? And when you have a very big ship, how do you defend that? And there are lots of different options that we have to be able to deal with capabilities. Investments need to continue there. And it's an issue where the Chinese will continue to advance their systems, will continue to advance ours. And there are advantages on one side, and then there are advantages that may grow on the other side. So when the U.S. Navy thinks about the future, they think about a number of things, including directed energy weapons. And so people look in terms of asymmetric capabilities. And so when you have a significant capability with kinetic weapons, many of the best thinking that we see, and the Navy's been experimenting with direct energy, is designed to be able to then take out large supplies of missile systems, maybe coming in at you with directed energy weapons, in addition to other non-kinetic capabilities that we have.
How well do we understand Chinese cyber capabilities, and how much of a worry is that to us?
It's a significant worry. I just told you that they're all up in our shorts with regard to penetrating the clear defense contractors, any American business that has a significant technology. You can be rest assured that they've been knocking at your door, or they've tried to penetrate. If you have Chinese that may be working, those Chinese may not have wanted to be a spy, but sometimes they get approached, and particularly if they have families in China. China will use that against them, and even if they don't want to give U.S. tech secrets, sometimes they are forced to do so, compelled to do so in ways that are truly nefarious, and that's happening in our country as well as other countries. And so on the cyber front, they can throw a lot of volume at us. We've seen them become more sophisticated in terms of their tool development, and they will continue to invest there. They have what they call the strategic support forces, and then they have subordinate to that the cyber forces. And those cyber forces work in concert with intelligence, and they work in concert with electronic warfare capabilities. And the Chinese think that the combination of these capabilities will give them significant information-related advantages in wartime as well. So the Chinese put a lot of chips down on this capability. We continue to find that they are all around us and in us, and if we were looking at our partners, our allies, et cetera, that the Chinese are swarming there too. It's a very, very serious threat, and I think we need to be more serious than we actually have been up to this point about dealing with it.
What are the Chinese designs in the polar regions? What does that mean economically, and what does it mean militarily?
Great question. So the Chinese are very, very interested in the poles. I'm glad somebody actually asked that, because I think that's been an area where it's like the dark side of the moon, like nobody knows what's going on. The Chinese are in both. They have icebreakers that go routinely up to the Arctic and down to the Antarctic, and they call themselves a near Arctic nation. That's, again, sort of Chinese propaganda designed to legitimize their ability to kind of work with the Arctic Council and to be up there. And much of this has both a security component and a resource, component to it. The Chinese have put a lot of investment down in the Antarctic, and they have different scientific stations down there that do various things, but some of them do more than scientific work. Nudge, nudge, wink, wink. And we can expect that what they're going to do is to try to take advantage of physically being there and being able to essentially change the nature of the Antarctic Treaty, I think, is up in 2047. Somebody may know better than me, but the Chinese are looking at that time period to say, I need to position myself in such a way that I am primed to be the best country to take advantage of a redefined Antarctic treaty. Let me help reshape it, and then I'm going to make it advantageous to me so I can better exploit the resources that are offered by the polar regions. And the same thing, there's not a treaty, but the same kind of issues take place with the Arctic. Part of it is what's on the seabed and in the water column, but other parts of it are the northern passageway that goes above Russia, and what comes with receding, ice rims, and the ability to convert that into more economical transportation options there in the future. And then what do they need to do to be able to protect their commerce that may traverse those areas?
Relative to diplomatic issues on the part of the Chinese, there are several questions of what really is a wolf warrior, and what does that mean to us?
You want me to speak to this? Yeah, there's a movie. It's like a special forces movie. I haven't seen it, but there was a Chinese party that was wronged. I think there was an American CIA, something behind, and the Chinese got insulted, and I'm mangling the plot. You guys look it up. You guys can Google it. But the Chinese, eventually got their revenge, tracked down the offending party, and were able to take care of them, and I think the Americans were at fault. And so it really inspired the nation, like the movie, The Battle of Lake Changjin, which is a Chosin Reservoir. So that really inspirited the Chinese. They're sticking it to their enemies, particularly the United States. And so it was really a call to express your nationalism and your pride in the country, to say, anybody that insults China, we're going to get you, right? We're going to get you no matter where you go, anywhere you go, at any time. And it's hard to believe that that was sort of a national sentiment, but that in fact is what happened. And you saw many Chinese diplomats then sort of borrow this and become wolfish and were very, very pushy, heavy-handed with many of the people in host nations and whatever. And it was really off-putting in so many different ways. I think the Chinese have maybe learned a lesson here. It's hard to tell whether or not they are trying to tone it down somewhat, but that's a strain of thought there that relates to the way China looks at its history and looks at its place in the world. And it says, essentially, look, you caused me this century of humiliation. You did not do right by the Chinese. There were injustices that were legitimate injustices. We were talking about them earlier. And that forms, for the Chinese psyche, this backdrop of, I need to stand up for myself, right? It is my right to stand up for myself. I will choose how to do that, and it is nothing more than what any other nation does for itself. And so this sometimes is taken to excess, but you can see the root of it being coming from a very legitimate place there. I'm proud of my nation. I want to see my nation do better. I want to find our rightful place. In the view of the leadership, it is at center stage of the world, on top of all countries. So for the average Chinese, they would like to have opportunity, but they also want to make sure that they not only have respect, but they also have their own voice in the world. And to me, that seems like a very rational thing to ask for.
Is a wolf warrior, was that spy balloon part of that strategy? The spy balloon flying over the United States?
No, I wouldn't equate the two. I think that this goes back to how much activity is going on with regard to espionage. And it's a little hard for an intelligence officer when I see so many examples of the way that the Chinese are conducting espionage, that the only thing that got America's attention was a silly balloon. So I can name 100 other things that we should be concerned about that we're alerting, and you had to physically see the balloon, right, to believe it. How much the leadership knew about the balloon technology, there's just so many different ways that the Chinese are trying to collect their information that it may be doubtful whether or not the senior leadership actually knew that it was there that day doing things. They said it was off course, and maybe we allow them the benefit of the doubt there. But the fact of the matter was, whoever was controlling that was going over our nuclear sites in sensitive areas in the country. It was very clearly equipped with intelligence gear, and it was collecting on vital areas within the United States, period, stop, right? We were in a legitimate right to be able to take care of that. The Chinese believe that, look, we can use the stratosphere. They're trying to redefine even what constitutes sovereign airspace. So the larger issue on the balloon is, if you really talked about what the Chinese may be trying to do, are they trying to actually demonstrate that, in fact, it is international commons above a certain altitude? If you're above 60,000 feet, is that international airspace, and do I have a right to fly anything I want there? And this was a little bit of a sort of a test case. There are folks who think that that's the case, that the sovereignty does not exist except up to a certain point. And the reality is that it goes up to space. Your sovereign airspace goes up to space and includes the stratosphere. The Chinese would love for that to be different, and they experimented for a while, thinking that in fact they can get away with that. And it's not just our country which has had spy balloons, over it. And there's a difference between being in international airspace, which we do with our aircraft, and we are using sensors to be able to pick up on things and monitor dangers to the international system or to allies and partners. That's different than you've decided to cross into somebody's international airspace without authority, and now you're collecting wherever you want to. And the balloons have been all over almost every Asian nation, and over the course of a couple of different years there. And so I'm glad the Chinese maybe have woken up to the fact that this is unacceptable, but it's unfortunate it took a shoot down to get there.
Get to Taiwan, back to Taiwan. Several people want to know, what is the likely U.S. response if the Chinese blockade Taiwan?
So that's up to the President of the United States to decide, and that's totally unclear to us. So as a military officer here, I'll tell you that we plan for everything. We've planned for a blockade. Surprise, surprise. And so whether or not the president chooses to execute that will depend on all the circumstances that those unique conditions require for an executive to be able to decide whether or not to do anything, whether to go very strong very quickly, whether or not to walk out the issue in a way that's perhaps more sophisticated and subtle. So those are hypotheticals that I'm afraid I won't get into, but you should be rest assured that your military has taken a look at every option that could be applied against Taiwan, and we have a contingency plan for all of them.
It is one note. I hear the claps out there. Relative again to Taiwan, Admiral Studeman wrote a book very recently relative, and I'm sure you've read that. We had him up here speaking, by the way, at one of our summer lecture series. And Warren Buffett has also said that he's slowly pulling some of Berkshire Hathaway's resources out of Taiwan. And what does this merit in terms of what people really think this is going to end up as?
I'm not sure how to answer that question. I do believe that every company needs to take a look at their risk associated with the China matters there that include Taiwan. And every company is going to have to make their own choices. I would suspect that some of them are thinking through, what do I need to know? What are my indicators for when I need to be able to potentially retrograde or gracefully pull out, and how much time does that take? And I would suspect that there are many companies that are soliciting advice from people who are professionals that understand that part of the world to be able to say, you know what, these are the things that if they are happening would suggest that within 6 months or a year or whatever it is, that you're likely going to face a crisis. And then therefore, we should be monitoring X, Y, and Z. It's essentially indications and warning. And I think a lot of companies are going to be more concerned about whether or not their indications and warning calculus is ready, is fresh, and it's up to date there because businesses will want to continue to do business for as long as they can if they're making profit, if the cost benefit works out. But these disruptions that could occur could really damage or maybe send a company under. So they've got to be very smart about how they approach it. So I'm not a businessman, but I can probably intuit that that's probably what's going on with many companies today that are operating in a flashpoint zone.
How much do we have time left? Okay. Can Taiwan protect itself?
Taiwan has a very strong capability, and their terrain is actually conducive for the defense. If you take a look at their beaches, there are very few ones that could be used for, let's say, an amphibious landing. Therefore, they are more easily defended. They would channel. They'd be able to channel opposing forces that would be coming in there. And then if you take a look at some of the infrastructure on the western side of Taiwan, with the road networks, with the canals, with the fields, very hard for heavy equipment to rapidly move through many areas where the Taiwans would have the advantage on the defense, and that stays true all the way through to the big cities and especially to Taipei. And then you have the whole mountain region, which is essentially, the eastern half, except for the southern tip, the eastern half of Taiwan, which also provides refuge, maneuver room, et cetera. So the Taiwan advantages in terms of the home base advantage are significant and would be used in time of war, to be sure. Now, we believe that the Taiwan military has strong capabilities, but will need stronger capabilities to deal with this massive growth in the PLA. And so we are clearly involved in trying to think through which other capabilities that they need, asymmetric capabilities, small, fast, lethal, mobile, not just big, heavy platforms that might be more easily found and more easily destroyed. So when we talk to Taiwan, we talk to them about their own needs, and we have some level of agreement that that moving towards a more hybrid capability would be very important for them to guarantee that if push comes to shove, that they would be able to defend themselves. And one of the most significant things with the Taiwans is taking a look at what it means for the entire country to be involved. The Chinese people believe in people's war, and the Taiwans have the same conception that the people's war, which would involve civil authorities in a time of great emergency, would then be able to tilt the table also in the defenders' advantage and favor. And so the Taiwans are looking very hard at what it takes to make sure they're ready to involve a whole of society, a defense of that democracy.
One thing that I'm trying to figure out how to phrase this actually in a careful way, but I'll do it. Dialogue, all right, and the necessity for dialogue. And it appears right now, and we've experienced a case of this where our Chinese speakers decided not to show up, and I'm sure that that command came from above. They didn't make it independently. Why is it that right now China seems to be setting forth on a tactic, or maybe it's a strategy, of diminishing dialogue at every level between our two governments?
Yeah, so we've pushed for hotlines for many, many years now with the Chinese. We've pushed for conversations. We used to have a number of different ways that we were consulting with them on maritime issues and some other security issues, defense issues, different consultative talks. And the Chinese have not come to those in many years. And so we had those four. We also had Track 1.5. We had ex-officials. It wasn't active government, but retired government. They actually still meet for some events. So there are some things there, but the Chinese really shut that down. And part of the philosophy is, well, there's nothing worth talking about. If you don't change your attitude, America, then I can't talk to you about a specific issue if your sentiment is all about hostility to the Chinese. So whether it's supply chain issues, technology issues, protecting ourselves, other things, the Chinese take a look and go, the climate just isn't right to talk to the Americans, right? It's completely pushing back on things and it's unfair, so why would I even talk to them? I know what they're going to say. They're going to say, China, change your ways or else. And so they don't really have prospects. In fact, the conditions are right to be able to make some ground and have us concede in certain areas or truly talk about change. They also believe that if we had like a hotline, you have to get into the logic here, that if we had a hotline, that Americans would be more provocative. Because if we had a hotline, it would be like a safety net or a get-out-of-jail-free card where it would be something you can just fall back to. And they think if there's no hotline, that maybe the U.S. would be less provocative and more conservative, and things would be, better off. So that's the logic that they use. So it doesn't make a whole lot of sense because that's not the way we plan or behave. But the Chinese are convinced that in fact is only going to potentially make us more aggressive if we have some way to sort of save a crisis from spiraling out of control. And they'd like us to self-censure and find a way to control our behavior. They think that withholding these talks is a way to incentivize change with regard to the United States.
Okay. Thank you very much. It's part of the end of these questions, but I would like to offer you the opportunity, if you would, to make a final statement to us. And one of the things that I've always been concerned about is I don't think the American public does enough to educate itself about these issues, to understand really what's going on. Yeah,
thanks. First of all, this session has been very enjoyable. I want to apologize for being so direct. If you haven't had a lot of this up to this point, when somebody's direct with you, it can be shocking, and you can almost look at it with disbelief. And I think that's a function of our inability to actually have open and continual conversations with the country in a way that we need to have. So I'm glad we had this particular session where we could really get a lot on the table, and maybe that generates more conversations and maybe more inquisitiveness with regard to what we're dealing with. The China rise issue has been defined as the most consequential element of the 21st century, right? How not only power is accumulated, but then how power is exercised. And you have a country that has a completely different view of what the world system should look like and how it should be ordered. They have a different conception of freedoms in the Chinese system. You should be good enough to have, your own material, physical, and recreational needs satisfied, but none other. You have no voice in political matters at all. If you look at Maslow's hierarchy of needs, for example, the United States and other Western countries believe, yes, we need to have opportunities for humans to flourish. It's you get the most out of humans when they can self-actualize, when they can actually pursue transcendent causes. That is not the view on the Chinese side. A more dominant China will be pushing the world in a direction which will essentially challenge not only the rules that govern interstate activity, but also some of these values there that we've cherished and that a lot of Americans, bled for, in previous wars. So the question is, how do we think about this challenge? How do we best deal with it? And for the United States, we need to deal with it in a unified fashion. And we need to get over our other issues, right? And not be so consumed with culture wars or the hatred of our fellow citizens and not realize that, in fact, the greater danger is coming from a different vector. It's not somebody who sits beside you or you pass on the road or you see in Washington. That's not where danger exists. The larger dangers come from decisions and dominant powers that have the capability to upset your way of life, right, and many others. And I just wish, here to close, that we had more conversations about these serious matters, and I think it would allow us to rise above ourselves and our inward focus to be able to stop navel gazing and take a look at where we really need to focus in order to define the future I think that we're all going to want. Thank you very much, everybody. How many more questions do you have in there? You got them all?
We're going to lunch now.
Excellent.